much, Mary. So I wanted to, again, also use this opportunity to thank Mary, because when I first became a manager, I actually did her course on being a people manager, and it was really amazing. And it really helped me as a person really grow and understand myself as a manager. So I've spoken at many conferences, but always on technical topics, right? And this past year, I changed my focus to be more on something that's a bit closer to home. I decided to focus on neurodiversity. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off by telling you my personal journey, and then we'll go into some detail about what neurodiversity is, and then finally, what we're going to do is going to start looking at ways we can support our colleagues. So, I am from the north of England, and throughout schooling, there were always ways in which I struggled, but not to the extent where it was noticed. So where I was struggling with my writing, it was suggested that I should try a different pen. When I struggled with paying attention, we made into a joke that I distracted the class by pointing out the aeroplane outside the window. And when I struggled with social situations, my parents pushed me into things like Scouts that forced me to meet new people. But it all came to a head in college, when one of the other students noticed how disorganized I was, and they suggested that the Special Education Needs Department might be able to help. I was referred to an educational psychologist who asked me lots of questions. And they went through a bunch of exercises, measuring things like my reading speed, my reading comprehension, and the readability of my handwriting, which is terrible. And they used that to start to understand what I struggled with. They wrote up a report detailing my dyslexia and dyspraxia assessment, which offered up ways in which my college could support me. And I finally got access to things like extra time and using computers in exams. This helped me significantly. I subsequently went on to university where I studied internet computing, and I was able to continue taking advantage of this enhanced support. I graduated in 2008, and after a couple of short roles, I was able to settle in a marketing agency called Crayon. And then as I started to become more established in my career, I started to get involved in the tech community, including going to my first conference, which was the jQuery conference in the UK. From my perspective, though, I really struggled with the social side of going to these events. And internally, I was struggling with meeting new people. When I attended meetups, for example, I would also find myself feeling awkward and alone. So I then took the next step and started speaking at meetups and subsequently conferences, much like this one. And this was actually easier because instead of me having to strike up conversations with people, they would approach me instead, asking me questions about my talk, which meant it was a lot easier to meet people. And I also made lots of friends. And as I continued my career, I worked at a few different startups. However, as I got more senior, I found myself struggling with imposter syndrome and anxiety. And after a particularly bad anxiety spiral during the COVID pandemic, I started to learn about what autism was. And then, ironically, I started to hyperfixate on it, reading a lot about it and taking all the online quizzes that I could find. My wife encouraged me to get assessed, and because I'm in the fortunate position as a software engineer, I was able to go private and have an autism assessment. And this was eye-opening for me. And since then, I've continued to learn so much about myself and become really self-aware of things I struggle with and how I should communicate about that. It also helped me know how I behave in certain ways and react to specific situations. Then, almost 2 years ago, I found myself looking for a new role for the first time with this information. And when you have this information about yourself, it makes you really think about the kind of role that's right for you. So when I was looking for roles, I then found a role at a company called Spendesk. And so these conditions I've talked about myself having, autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, they all fall under the umbrella term of neurodiversity. So what is neurodiversity? So before I jump into this section, I really want to caveat it by saying I'm not a psychologist. And while I've tried to be as accurate as possible, this is all based on personal research. And where I talk about symptoms, the slides will be very detailed with information from the National Health Service website. So I was trying to find a really good definition of what neurodiversity is. And I came across this article on Harvard Health. And it describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. When people's brains work differently from the norm, they're referred to as neurodivergent. This means a person has different strengths and struggles from people that develop or work more typically. The possible differences include medical disorders, learning disabilities, and other conditions. The possible strengths include a better memory, ability to solve complex mathematical calculations in their head, and even being able to think about problems in completely different ways. And unfortunately, these conditions have been consistently underdiagnosed across the world. This is due to a lack of awareness and insufficient resources. For example, a shortage of child psychologists has led to waiting lists for as long as 5 years in the UK. And this is actually, when I've done research for other countries, it's similar across the board. And many people end up going private. This means that estimating the number of neurodivergent people across the world can be incredibly difficult. However, most resources tend to agree the number is 1 in 7 people. But if we dig deeper into tech, we'll find that the Tech Talent Charter did a report, and the number was closer to 53%. But what's more shocking is only 3% of tech workers actually disclose it. And it can be various reasons. However, many come down to not feeling psychologically safe to do so. And it's important that we point out that neurodiversity is a spectrum. Different people have different experiences. And it's not a line where you're neurotypical on one end and neurodiverse on the other. It's more like this diagram shows here. It's a spectrum of different traits that people may have more or less of. This means, just like a person's fingerprints, a person's traits are completely unique to them. So let's have a look at some different types of neurodiversity. I'm going to be looking at four that are reasonably more common. These are ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. If I had more time today, I would cover more, but I haven't got the time, unfortunately. But so first up, ADHD. So for ADHD, which is short for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, symptoms are categorized in 2 categories. The first of which is inattentiveness. So inattentiveness includes having a short attention span and being easily distracted, making careless mistakes, appearing forgetful or losing things, being unable to stick to tasks that are tedious or time-consuming, appearing to be unable to listen to or carry out instructions, and having difficulty organizing tasks. The other category is hyperactive impulsiveness. And this includes constantly fidgeting, being unable to concentrate on tasks, excessive talking and interrupting conversations, being unable to wait their turn, acting without thinking, and a little or no sense of danger. So now that you understand the symptoms, I really want to start challenging some of the stereotypes that ADHD has and you might have heard of. So one of the common stereotypes that I've heard is the hyperactivity of running all around the place. So what I picture here is that naughty schoolboy that's got ADHD. But the reality is a lot of people with ADHD have internalized hyperactivity, which leads to a noisy, busy mind. So lots of things going in the mind at once. There's also a stereotype that people with ADHD are always interrupting conversations, when the reality is they're trying to work out social cues of when to talk, and sometimes they get it wrong. They might also have something they need to say before they forget. And in the age of where we're working remotely a lot more, on a video call, this is even harder. And for the next stereotype is that they're not unable to concentrate on tasks, but the reality is that they are actually thinking about 5 to 6 things simultaneously, and they're unable to prioritize. And we have being forgetful, and the reality is, because ADHD does have an impact on short-term memory, they're often using notes and reminders to try and help them to remind themselves, but they sometimes will forget. So strengths that come from ADHD. So people with ADHD are often more creative, which in a development role can mean they come up with more creative and outside-of-the-box ideas to solve problems they're tasked with. A state of hyperfocus, which is common for people with ADHD, can allow them to zoom in on one particular task and achieve a lot in a small amount of time. Anecdotally, this is something I've I do a lot of going into hyperfocus, and people are, oh, Jonathan did such amazing job getting this thing done. I was like, but I actually had focus for a small amount of time and then procrastinated. And then there's also this thing about ADHD being more risk tolerant, meaning they might be more open to trying solutions that people might not be willing to try, which is great in an incident. So the next one is autism. So autism is a diagnosis given to people with challenges with communication and interaction with other people, understanding how other people think or feel, finding things like bright lights or loud noises overwhelming, stressful, or uncomfortable, getting anxious or upset about unfamiliar situations and social events, taking longer to understand information, and doing or thinking the same things over and over. Now we understand the symptoms, let's have a look at some of the stereotypes, many of which actually become ingrained in us because of the media. So the first of which is wanting things to be done their own way or no way. When the reality is that often they will struggle with situations outside of what they're prepared for. For example, if a meeting is brought forward at a short notice, then it's going to lead to them struggling. There's also this thing that's played out in the media a lot, is that all autistic people are savants or possess exceptional talents. But the reality is that people with autism have the same wide range of abilities, strengths, and skills as the neurotypical counterparts. Then we have autistic people lack empathy or emotion. However, the reality is they struggle with expressing and processing emotions. This does not mean they lack them. From a strengths point of view, people with autism quite often have a logical and methodological thinking ability. They also quite often have a really strong attention to detail, which is, from a coding perspective, you really want them to review your pull request. And a passion for their interests means they're likely to find a role that aligns with their interests and be passionate about what they're building and build the best product for their users. Dyslexia. So dyslexia is a diagnosis given to people with challenges with reading and writing very slowly, having poor and inconsistent spelling, understanding information when told verbally, but having difficulty with information when written down, and planning and organization. And now we understand a bit more of the parts of dyslexia. Let's have a look at some of the stereotypes. So a really common one is that people with dyslexia can't read. So the reality is they simply find it more difficult to decode and comprehend written text. In fact, my son, he actually scored at being the 95th percentile in being able to read the text. He just struggled with the comprehension.
Hope you're enjoying this video, but did you know LeadDev has lots more to offer?
So webinar, podcasts, I even like articles, conferences, events, and most importantly, community.
And even thinking about like process, tech, and people, which is how LeadDev website is laid out, I really think this is the #1 learning platform for me as an engineering manager.
Don't forget to check out leaddev.com.
Another stereotype is that people with dyslexia simply need to try harder, where the reality is that the effort that someone puts into reading isn't related to how they comprehend it. And the final stereotype that I want to talk about is that dyslexia is a visual problem. The reality is that dyslexic people are no more or less likely to have a vision-related problem, and actually to ensure that vision isn't an issue, before performing a dyslexia assessment, the person being assessed needs to have a recent eye test to rule that out. And if we're looking at from a strengths perspective, people with dyslexia can have really good visual spatial reasoning. That can mean that they can think in multiple steps ahead and identify mistakes they need to avoid when building out a solution. This is great when you're planning out a project. They're also great at thinking outside the box, and they excel in areas that do depend on reading, such as maths and computing, that don't rely on the reading and writing. Cool. So the next one is a developmental coordination disorder, which is also known as dyspraxia. Cool. Dyspraxia is a diagnosis given to people who may have challenges with coordination, balance, and movement, learning new skills, thinking and remembering information, writing, typing, drawing, and grasping small objects, managing their emotions, and time management, planning, and organization skill. Back to when I told my story, it was my organization that brought my dyspraxia to people's attention. If we look at some of the stereotypes, the first of which is that people with dyspraxia are just clumsy. But the reality is that careful walking around can still lead them into bumping and tripping over things. Just last week, I was walking carefully down the aisle in the shop, and I just literally walked into the display stand. And then people with dyspraxia have low intelligence. However, their struggles with fine motor skills is not related to a low intellect. And people with dyspraxia are just disorganized. No matter how much effort they put into the organization, I know this is definitely the case for me, I can try my best to organize things. Things will just fall out of organization anyway. Strengths that come from dyspraxia. So similar to some of the others, creative thinking is common for people with dyspraxia. Excelling in problem solving and being sensitive to the needs of others, which means quite often they can be good champions for inclusivity. So I've talked about 4 different conditions today. However, the umbrella of neurodiversity is huge. As you can see on this really nice illustration from the lived experience educator. It's really good at showing that the number of different conditions is quite large. And it's also worth remembering that a number of these conditions can exist. For example, I have a diagnosis of autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. And while these traits vary from person to person, often you won't be able to see all of these traits that do affect them because they are so good at hiding them. This is referred to as masking. It's an unconscious strategy that all humans develop when growing up in order to connect those around us. For neurodivergent folk, however, they often experience greater pressure to hide their true selves and spend their entire lives hiding their traits and trying to fit in. This in itself can be harmful to our own well-being and can even result in people not being diagnosed till later in life because they hid it so well in childhood. So, the people here are a mix of senior leaders in tech and including managers. So we really want to know, how do we support our neurodivergent colleagues? So the first of which is making sure you're providing psychological safety. And the first way in which you can do this is make sure they feel safe in sharing about their neurodiversity. They will likely be unsure about whether they should share this information about themselves. They will be thinking about whether they need to let their HR know, whether they need to let the manager know, and if they need to let their colleagues know. And there is advantages and disadvantages of telling these people. For example, letting HR know of your disability should mean they're able to help with accommodations you might need, such as tools that aid with writing, such as Grammarly, or tools that help with organization. Letting your manager know should help you figure out the best way for them to communicate with you and how they can give you feedback. And letting your colleagues know might help you effectively with communicating with them. The problem is, it isn't given that any of these people will support you. And in some cases, you can be made into feel like you're being a problem. So for me, I need to feel psychologically safe in my workplace to be able to tell people. And while I don't expect my manager to immediately be knowledgeable of my needs, I want a manager who cares enough to want to learn and grow as a person as well. You also want to ensure that they feel comfortable asking questions. So given that many neurodivergent people might misunderstand things, it's important that you make them feel comfortable. To do this, you need to ensure you're always approachable, and even if the answer to the question seems obvious, avoid being dismissive so they remain comfortable bringing questions to you in the future. The next area that you can help with is communication. So you want to be considerate about when you arrange a meeting, ensuring that you provide them with as much information as possible so they know what to plan for and don't feel anxious of knowing what to expect. Especially if the meeting is one of those quick one-to-ones, make sure you tell them what it's about and they're not being fired. We should also be ensuring that we are using clear and concise communication. They might struggle with sarcasm or jokes to ensure that you make it clear if you're being sarcastic or making a joke to avoid miscommunication. I know when I write a joke on Slack, I always write joke in brackets, just in case they don't get it. It can also be helpful to use closed rather than open questions where appropriate, as it can help them avoid being confused about what you mean. And also, if you have an important communication that you need to send out, make sure you send it out in more than one format. So say you're sending out an all-company email, send a video recording as well. If they have a big policy document that they want to read, make sure you highlight key points that don't get missed. Another way you can be more mindful towards your colleagues is to assume the best intent when they communicate with you. Sometimes they might come across as direct about something because something they see as clear-cut, or they might be trying to respond in a timely manner. They might try and push their ideas over others. However, sometimes it's just a case of being passionate. Rather than assuming the worst, try to clarify the situation and give feedback if you think they could handle the communication in a better way, as they will likely appreciate it. Next up is time management. So we want to make sure that we're providing a clear routine and work schedule. This helps them plan their time and ensure that they are able to be prepared. Where you need to make changes to the schedule, make sure that you let them know as soon as you can, and make sure their needs are taken into account. In an engineer's day-to-day, they're likely to need to carry out a series of tasks. So it's important that you give them as clear and concise instructions when possible. If the task is particularly big, you might want to consider breaking it down to avoid being overwhelming, and this can be done as a team to ensure that there's a shared understanding of the project. And you can also use spikes as a way to identify a way of solving problems, which does help prevent decision paralysis. I think one of the problems with that last comment, though, is as we become more senior, we're expected to take on more ambiguity, right? But where you have to have ambiguity, it's important that you are there to support them, being able to answer their questions, and when they come up with solutions, be able to there as a soundboard. And something that can be really useful is setting clear deadlines. I know when I was writing this talk, I set myself clear deadlines, and I had people who held me accountable. And because those people were holding me accountable, it ensured that this talk was written plenty ahead of time. So I had my first deadline in August, so that I was making good progress. The next area of support is attention and focus. So if you're arranging meetings for your team, it's tempting to bunch them together to ensure the team has a longer period of focus. However, this can be counterintuitive as this can lead to mental exhaustion. Instead, make sure there's adequate breaks and time to decompress between meetings, and check with your neurodivergent colleagues that the number of meetings isn't causing them any problems. And outside of meetings, it's incredibly important to be mindful of their focus time and make them feel comfortable in saying no when something's going to interrupt that. Let's have a look at sensory sensitivity. A lot of us, at least some of our time, now have to return to the office. But because all the time this is not every day of the week, many companies are starting to keep smaller offices with hot desking. For some people with autism, for example, this can be uncomfortable if they like the consistency of knowing where they're going to work. So if possible, you should look at ensuring the days they are in, they have the same desk so they have that consistency. It's also important to avoid they are able to work in an environment without sensory distractions. So ideally, their desk should be situated where it's quieter, with less people passing through that could distract them. And the final area I want to touch on is how you support your neurodivergent colleagues and with how they process information. So the first way is to adapt how we carry out training. Most companies have mandatory training, such as GDPR, anti-bribery, and health and safety. And this can take many forms. Sometimes it's onboarding manual, pre-recorded video, and it doesn't take into account individual ways someone learns. So while this impacts all employees, for neurodivergent employees, they can struggle with focus even more. With it being possible, they become easily distracted. So, and if they do manage to pay attention, they might struggle to recall the content later. The way in which businesses can adapt this is to offer the training in various different formats. So maybe offering an e-learning-based version for people who want to do it ad hoc. Also have workshops so people can choose what's right for them. Also, when you're presenting data, you want to make sure that any data that's going to be discussed in the meeting is shared ahead of time. This will give them the chance to understand the data ahead of the meeting without the added time pressure. You should also consider using the use of visual representations where we are comparing two or more pieces of data, where we're comparing two pieces or more pieces of data so they can see the differences. Finally, you should consider the way in which you process information and how you deliver feedback. For me, I find the situation behavior model incredibly impactful here, as it allows you to explain your understanding ahead of the situation and have an honest conversation about their own understanding of the situation. When considering feedback, it's also worth being aware of a condition called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is an intense emotional reaction to perceived criticism or rejection, more commonly experienced by neurodivergent individuals. This means that feedback, even if it's constructive and well-intentioned, may be felt more deeply, so it's important to deliver with extra care and understanding. Wrapping up. So every neurodivergent individual, so I've talked about lots of ways you can support them, but you should make sure you talk to the individual on how they want to be supported. And adapting how we work in this way can lead to our teams working in a more inclusive way. And through having empathy for our neurodivergent colleagues, we can really help them play to their strengths and not feel awkward and alone. And I want to leave you on this. This is one of the points, is that we should prioritize the needs of the few rather than the convenience of the many. Helping your neurodivergent colleagues will help you get the most out of them. So I've got a quick QR code here, but I'm going to which is for a second. But I want to leave you on one last point. When you start to improve the way we organize our teams to be more accessible to those who are neurodivergent, we also improve them for everyone else. There is a term for this, the curb cut effect, coined after when we adapt our streets to those less physically abled, we are able to leave them for everyone else. Thank you.